My name's Mike Worley. I'm the Dean for Postdoctoral Affairs and Grad Studies. I want to thank you for being here for our inaugural Emeritus lecture. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to our colleagues and friends who are streaming online, including the Overland Park Police Department. So welcome virtually. This Emeritus lecture is the first in what will become an annual event. Each fall, a KUMC Emeritus faculty member will present a lecture to the KUMC community on a topic related to their area of expertise and experience. All faculty, staff, and students are welcome to attend. The Emeritus lecture is part of a greater effort on campus to better engage our Emeritus faculty through various networking and continued learning activities. I am extremely thrilled to have Dr. Alan Rawitch here today as our inaugural speaker and distinguished guest. Dr. Rawitch has been instrumental in spearheading efforts to coordinate Emeritus initiatives on campus, so he seems like a logical choice for the first speaker. Upon his retirement in 2016, doesn't seem that long ago, from the University of Kansas Medical Center, after 41 years of service, Dr. Rawitch was appointed as Professor Emeritus and Vice Chancellor Emeritus. While at KUMC, his research focus was in molecular endocrinology, where he authored multiple published papers, and in the area of thyroid function and pancreatic hormone structure and function. In addition to serving on KUMC faculty for more than 40 years, Dr. Rawitch served in several administrative roles, including 13 years of Dean of Graduate Studies and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. In 2016, Dr. Rawitch retired from the rank of captain with the City of Overland Park Police Department. He had 37 years of part-time service in that capacity. Dr. Rawitch worked as a patrol officer for 25 years, receiving a number of awards for his work, in addition to promotions in rank, and before his retirement, served as a detective in the investigations division. I'll never forget one of my first faux pas. I was out shopping at Overland Park Mall, and I saw Dr. Rawitch's twin, all dressed up in full blues. And I walked in, I was like, I never knew you had a twin brother. And he said, you idiot, that was me. So the amount of work that Alan did was amazing, to do both those high-level jobs at a very, very, very high level of quality and candor. It was very good to talk to him about that. All right, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Rawitch, whose presentation today is titled, The Shootings at Kent State University, a 50-year perspective from a professor and police officer. Dr. Rawitch.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for coming. I thought I would begin by telling you about the history of this lectureship, but as you've just heard, this is the inaugural lecture, so there isn't any history to talk about, but I hope it will be the first of a continuing series. You can see my titles, all of which at this point in time I'm retired from. I thought it would be interesting to start by showing you a collection of ID cards. This was my ID card from Kent State University. This was one of my commission cards as an officer for the Overland Park Police Department, and this is what I retired from, the Office of Academic Affairs. No comments, please, on the color of hair, lack of hair, etc. over the years. First of all, my credentials. This is sort of my background. I'm not going to say very much about the beginning. I grew up in Southern California in the San Fernando Valley. 2 years of community college, and then attended UCLA to finish my bachelor's in chemistry / pre-med, and then a PhD in biological chemistry at the biological chemistry department in the School of Medicine at UCLA. I did 2 years of postdoctoral work with Gregorio Weber at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and took my first faculty job, which is the start of this story. I went there in 1969, the summer of 1969, as an assistant professor. Before I left there, I had achieved tenure and encountered a lot about law enforcement, and that's part of the rest of the story. I joined the faculty at KU in 1975, and Dr. Worley has already talked about that. In 1978, if time allows, I'll tell you how I became a part-time police officer, which I did for not 37, but 38 years. These are some of the places I worked early on, they included, when I was 14, working at a nursery. My first research experience was in a prostate cancer research lab at the Wadsworth VA Hospital when I was an undergraduate and through the very beginning of my graduate studies. While I was at Kent State, in addition to working my research and teaching, I chaired a committee called the Security Advisory Committee, and you'll hear more about that shortly. And I did that for 3 years, and that is significant in this story and what I will tell you about Kent State. And I'm going to go through the events of 1970 and the shootings, but then I hope tell you a little bit about the effect it had on the campus, because I remained, from the perspective of a faculty member, both an observer and participant in those activities. The rest you know about. I think Dr. Worley reviewed this for you in terms of my police experience. During the course of the years that I was at KU, I had wonderful opportunities to interact with students and enjoyed it very much. This was an event at the Capitol that we helped organize that was research presentations of our graduate students for legislators, and frequently the lieutenant governor would attend as well. And of course, for 38 years, I proudly wore this uniform, although the last 13, not so much, because detectives work in plain clothes, and so I didn't put this on very often. So, how does a quiet, young assistant professor find himself in the middle of a significant national event, and how he learned a lot about the world and its power structure? When I accepted a position at Kent State as an assistant professor in the biochemistry division of the chemistry department there, a new medical school was being planned, and that was one of the things that attracted me to the position. It was supposed to grow to be a sister campus to Ohio State, and so it looked like a chance to get in on the ground floor of what was a really expanding university. In May of the following year, less than a year after I went there, my whole world changed with the episodes that occurred over the weekend of May 1st through May 4th. The shootings of students occurred on May 4th when the Ohio National Guard opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. And I'll talk more in detail about that in a moment. Following several days of unrest and other concerning incidents, on May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, I was recruited and, quote, volunteered to an ad hoc group of faculty that were called Faculty Senate Observers, and their purpose was to be objective observers and also to preserve the peace where possible. The following slides are going to be a presentation of photographs and a map that shows you exactly what happened on that day of May 4th. This was the armband that we wore on the periphery of all of these events. I still have it at home, along with a billy club that was presented to me with a little engraved plate on it from the Kent State University Police Department. Timeline of events. This began and was triggered by the announcement on April 30th by President Richard Nixon of an invasion of Cambodia by US troops to attack the Viet Cong sanctuary and headquarters that were said to be in Cambodia. And this was a significant escalation of the Vietnam War effort. On May 1st, the next day, there were anti-war rallies held on many campuses. And I would remind some of the younger folks in the audience that may not remember this period of time. We had an active draft. And so the Vietnam War and the draft were very, very serious issues for young people. And that contributed in part clearly to the concerns about the war. There were anti-war speeches given at the Kent State campus. At a rally at noon, a copy of the US Constitution was buried in protest. And that evening, the normal socialization and activities at the student bars, which were in town, Kent is a small town. At that time, its population was about 20,000. Students frequently would congregate in these bars a couple of blocks from the campus. It escalated that night into some confrontations with the police. They built some bonfires. They broke a couple of windows in stores in the downtown area. And the police were called along with extra police from other areas, ultimately closing the bars, and they drove the students then back onto the campus using tear gas at that point in time. The mayor of Kent became very concerned about this and in fact called the governor that night. The mayor declared a state of emergency for the city when he activated these local police, but called the governor and asked for help. The governor, James Rhodes, at the time was running as a law and order candidate for the Senate. And that, I suspect, may weigh into this a bit in terms of his actions. In any event, using tear gas, the police drove the students back onto the campus area, and the bars were closed. On Saturday, May 2nd, the mayor met with city officials and a representative of the Ohio National Guard, and his name was Leroy Satram, and played a role in escalating this event, although he certainly doesn't bear all the blame for the ultimate results. The National Guard representative was there. The Guard had already been activated about a month before because of a trucking strike in Ohio where there had been violence and gunfire. So they'd been away from their homes and activated for this trucking strike for some time. But they were also already deployed, and so they arrived very quickly. When they arrived on Saturday night, they encountered about 1,000 students gathered around the site of the ROTC building, which had been set ablaze and was burning. A few students even tried to stop the firefighters from extinguishing this fire, but I will tell you that this building didn't take much to burn it to the ground. It was an old frame building built after World War II, and quite a small building. And I'll show you a picture of that shortly. By morning, approximately 1,000 National Guard troops were stationed in and around the campus. That Sunday morning, I went to my lab to check on an experiment I had running, and I encountered soldiers and several armored personnel carriers at the entrance to the campus. And they were cordial, they let me through. I think one of them did ask to see some identification, so on, but the campus was still open at this point in time, and so I proceeded to take care of what I needed to at my lab. But later that morning, the governor held a press conference that was carried on the radio, in which he gave a very provocative statement. He called the students the worst kinds of people in America and said he was going to use force to put down these protests and use names for them, which I won't repeat here. And he said he was going to declare a state of emergency on the campus. And he also indicated that all rallies and gatherings would be banned under what, in essence, was martial law. It was assumed at that point in time by both the university and the campus that the campus control resided with the National Guard. Monday, May 4th, and I'm going to read this verbatim because I want to get the details exactly correctly. And at this point in time, I had been recruited to this volunteer group. There had been another rally called on Friday the 1st for noon on May 4th to continue protesting the war and now protesting the troops on campus and the military being deployed. So while there were some sporadic clashes between the students and the Guard on Sunday night, Monday morning began quietly. The university administration was absolutely certain that allowing demonstrations would not be a good thing, and they printed up flyers and sent the word out that they did not want the rally to occur. However, by 11 o'clock, students began to gather in an area called the Commons around the Victory Bell, which was usually rung for football victories and so on. It was a big grassy area. And you'll see some pictures of that shortly. About 3,000 students, and this number varies depending on whose report that you read, but large numbers of students were in the Commons area, and a rally started. While many of the students were there protesting the war and the troops on campus, there were many others that were simply there because they heard about it and were spectators. So they were simply observing. At around noon, the general in charge of the Guard decided the students needed to be dispersed, and an announcement was made to that effect. It was met with anger, shouting, and some rocks thrown at the Jeep carrying the officer who made this announcement with a bullhorn. The general then ordered his troops to prepare, and they marched on the crowd with fixed bayonets, firing tear gas as they went. The students were driven up and over a hill toward a practice football field, and after 10 or 15 minutes, and having driven the core group of students into the fenced area with occasional rocks being thrown at them, they began to retreat back toward the Commons area. Now, I should tell you that when this occurred, many of the students peeled off, went inside buildings, and left, but there was a substantial core of students that continued to protest, and the Guard herded them onto a practice football field. And I'll show you a map in a moment so you see how that geography lays out. After 10 to 15 minutes, because the students were trapped up against some high fences in the practice football field, the Guard retreated. But before they retreated, several groups of them were shown, and I'll show you a picture, to confer, and then continue to retreat back the way they came. The practice football field and this area that they were driven to were up and over a hill from the Commons area, and I'll point that out to you. At one point in time, the Guard turned, knelt, and pointed their guns at the students, but no shots were fired at that time. As they retraced their route and neared the top of the hill, suddenly a group of the guardsmen turned and fired their weapons down the hill towards the students. While some fired in the air and some in the ground, over 60 rounds were fired, resulting in 4 dead and 9 wounded students. And what followed then was a tense standoff between the remaining students, the guard, with faculty, including myself, pleading with the students to leave to avoid further bloodshed. In response to pleas from the faculty, the students did finally leave the area, and the university was immediately closed and sealed off with everyone, students, faculty, and staff, removed from the campus. Faculty were not allowed back on the campus and tried to finish their courses by improvising. For example, I finished the nursing biochemistry course that I was teaching at the time at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, which was about a 30-mile drive from the campus. Well, much has been written since. Many lawsuits were filed and ultimately were resolved in attempting to analyze and document these results. This is my account, however. First of all, a map. Up in this corner, where the star is, in the upper left-hand corner, is the Commons area and the Victory Bell. This is where the rally occurred, and the students were forced up this hill, down the other side, and into the practice football field area here, which was a fenced area, at least this part of it. The arrows indicate the path that the National Guard took, driving the students up over the hill into the practice football field, and then the Guard retreated. The Guard then, at this point in time, knelt and pointed their guns, as I indicated to you, but did not fire. When they got near the top of the hill, they turned suddenly and fired down this hill into this parking lot. And this is where the wounded and dead students were done. I'll show you pictures of some of this. The 4 dots here were where the students were killed. Note this umbrella-like structure, this little cupola. That's where the Guard stopped, turned, and fired, very close to the top of this hill. So this is a downhill area. This building is called Taylor Hall. This building is called Prentice Hall. They're both classroom buildings. Now some pictures. There were anti-war protests on many campuses, even before the invasion of Cambodia. This is a picture of one of students, quote, harassing a ROTC formation on campus. So this is not military per se, this is ROTC. And I should point out that, I don't know, well, you can see it, these flags are being carried by the color guard of the ROTC, not by the protesting students, which are around the corner. This is a picture that was taken on Sunday morning, and this is what I encountered when I came onto the campus. This was at the very corner of the campus. These were the APCs, or armored personnel carriers, that were deployed at each entrance to the campus. The soldiers at that point on Sunday morning, as I said, were cordial, courteous, and so on, but were clearly standing guard. When they started dispersing students on Monday morning and breaking up any groups that formed even before the rally and so on, and if you were asked for identification, this is what you encounter. And I guess you might agree this could be pretty intimidating. It's not shown here, but he has a rifle as well. This was also Sunday morning, and this was the ROTC building. And you can see it was essentially completely burned to the ground. It was a wood frame building and not a huge structure. The guard was posted, standing guard around the periphery. And you will note that one here has a fixed bayonet. Most of them did not at this point in time. But when they dispersed students, they marched on them with bayonets fixed, and I'll show you that. Here again are some students, or excuse me, some guard around the periphery. Note that the campus was still open at this point in time, and this is before May 4th. Here's a group preparing to disperse students. And as you can see, they had fixed bayonets. They had not yet deployed their tear gas and put their masks on yet. This picture was taken at the beginning of the dispersal on May 4th. You can see the students gathered around the Victory Bell. This is that building, Taylor Hall, that I pointed out to you in the map. And as the guard marched on them, they began marching toward the students. An announcement had been made by the National Guard that this was an illegal assembly and they had to disperse. And when the students ignored that, the order was given for these guardsmen to march on the students. As the guard neared the students and so on, they began firing tear gas. This is the side of Taylor Hall, and this is that hill I talked about. And the students were driven up the hill. Many of the students at that point in time began leaving, moving to the periphery and getting out of the way of the guard. But a core group continued to confront the guard. Taken just a few minutes later, you can see many of the students have gone off to the side, but more tear gas being fired. A lot of the students at this point in time were leaving the area, staying out of the way of the guard. When the guard drove the students into this practice football field area, before they began their retreat back up the hill, this is a picture of those conferences that they held, presumably planning strategy or explaining what they were going to do to the troops before they began to retreat. Here are the lead contingent of the guard driving the students over the hill. Note, again, for a reference point, this umbrella-like or cupola structure. This is an infamous picture. I have several of these, but this one shows the actual moment the guard opened fire on the students from near the top of the hill by that umbrella-like structure. And you'll note a few of them were firing in the air, a couple into the ground. But during that period of time, as I said earlier, over 60 rounds were fired down the hill toward the students. This is a picture of the field of fire that they were firing down into. This is a parking lot down the hill, and they've begun to fire. The numbers here, and this one's cut off, 1, 2, 3, and 4, were where the 4 students whose names are shown in the bottom of the slide were killed. And there were others wounded and so on, some of who, if you look very closely, are visible in the picture. This again is a picture after the firing stopped of students attempting to give aid to one of the wounded students. You will note that in none of these pictures does it look like the students were charging the guard in large numbers. Mostly they were moving away from the guard and clearly when the gunfire erupted, fleeing. You can see a student that was hit lying on the ground. The firing lasted only 10 or 15 seconds. And when it started, the commander of the National Guard, who was behind this group, started yelling and jumping up and down, "Ceasefire, ceasefire." And they did. But the damage at that point in time to the students, of course, was already done. The Guard regrouped near the top of the hill where they'd been, and the next thing was to try and get aid to the wounded students that had been hit. No medical aid was rendered immediately except by other students. But the students tried to organize, and most of them were in shock, because if you talk to the students, most of them did not think that the Guard came onto the campus with live bullets or bullets loaded in their guns. It turned out that, in fact, they were ordered to load and lock their weapons when they came onto the campus. As I said, medical aid didn't arrive immediately, but other students tried to help. This is one of the wounded students, with others trying to give first aid. The same here. This picture, some of you that lived through those times may remember seeing. Actually, it's of a young lady over the dead body of a student named Jeffrey Miller. This one was a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph by the same photographer, and it made the cover of Life magazine and a lot of newspaper covers and so on. And Mr. Philo, who took this picture, won the Pulitzer Prize for it. It's an interesting story behind this young lady. She was not a student at Kent State, although she was first described as such in the headlines or headline stories. She was a runaway from Florida that had somehow found her way to the Kent State campus and to the protest. Not much is known about her earlier activities, whether she protested or not, but she was made famous in this photograph. Again, and here's one of my faculty colleagues at this point in time attempting to talk to the students and get aid to the students when they can. The closest hospital was in the next town. The only ambulance immediately available was a student-run ambulance service, which did come fairly early onto the scene, followed by 2 or 3 other ambulances from the area. The students were in shock, and they were not going anyplace. There was a significant group of students that wanted to sit down and continue to protest. Faculty continued to talk to them and convince them that there had already been bloodshed. It was time to leave, and we would deal with this later. It took a while, and during that period of time, students being carried by other students in many cases were removed to the hospital. This is another one of my colleagues named Franck. Glenn was a psychology professor, and he got a hold of a bullhorn and continued to talk and plead with the students, and was convincing enough that ultimately the students did finally leave the area, which was of great relief to all of the rest of us. It's a picture of the student ambulance, the first one to leave, carrying students from the scene. So back to the map. I didn't put the dots on here, but the students that were killed were here, here, and here. And one of the things that was an issue in a lot of the discussions after this shooting was the guard under immediate threat from the students? I should point out that there was no firearm taken from any student, despite the fact that there were early claims that the first shot was fired at the guard by someone that was never substantiated. And the number of students close to the guard when they fired was a very small number, a handful. To give you an idea of perspective, the 4 students that were killed ranged from 270 feet to 390 feet away from the guard's firing position. The students that were wounded, there were a couple of them on the hillside that were wounded that were as close as 60 feet, but the rest ranged from 100 to 750 feet away from the guard's position. This became an issue because after the shootings, of course, the question was, why did they open fire and so on? And there has been much written, mostly speculation. There were lawsuits. The guard testified in many of them. And so I've listed for you here some of the theories. They conspired to kill students, they, the guard. Someone shot at them first. There was no evidence of either of those two, nor that they were ordered to open fire. There was some discussion as to whether or not, in that picture I showed you of the guard firing, the individual pointing a pistol at the end of that platoon may have given an order to open fire, but that's never been established. Number 4 is the one that I favor. Somebody panicked and squeezed off a round, and the rest then reacted and opened fire. What the guard claimed was that they opened fire because they were in fear for their lives. And this case was made in multiple lawsuits and was accepted in most of those lawsuits. The guard was not found liable for a number of reasons, including the fact that the case was made that they were government employees or in employ of the government. Number 6 is absolutely true, and that became very evident to me both there and in the 38 years afterwards as I worked as a policeman. They were poorly trained and equipped for crowd control. The governor brought a military unit to quell a civil disturbance. And military units, particularly back then, were certainly not trained in any significant way for crowd control. And the concept of marching on groups with fixed bayonets to disperse them today would seem rather bizarre to us. So they were a military group called to quell a civil disturbance. They were poorly trained and poorly equipped for crowd control. I guess I would add to that at this point in time, police departments have a tremendous selection of non-lethal weapons that they can use for these kinds of things that range from close order things like tasers, and I know those are controversial and so on, but by and large, they're frequently used and save lives as opposed to using the alternative, a firearm. And all kinds of other projectiles that can be fired. You hear a lot in the international news these days about rubber bullets. Those are not a choice that law enforcement in this country use very much because they can cause serious harm as well. But we have balsa wood pellets that can be fired out of shotguns and all kinds of things that are alternatives to the use of lethal force. Those were not available at that point in time. So we're going to never know for sure. And there were, I think, 5 lawsuits, state and federal, that litigated this and so on. But my hope is that we can prevent a future tragedy with training and good leadership. Now, some comments on the leadership. The university leadership was not strong in this. In fact, the president of the university was off at a conference the weekend that this occurred. The leadership in the city, the mayor, got panicky early on and called the governor. The governor responded very strongly, I believe, and it's my personal opinion in part because he was running for the Senate as a law and order candidate, and he was going to put down this disturbance strongly. The Guard was not well prepared. The Guard leadership probably not well prepared to deal with a situation like this. So good leadership is absolutely critical. The most critical thing is that when we have disturbances like this, the military option should be the absolute last resort that we use. Had the highway patrol been brought in, for example, or more domestic police and so on, I believe that we wouldn't be having this talk today. So, I want to briefly tell you about life after the shootings on the campus. When the campus reopened in the fall of 1970, enrollment had dropped by about 30% at the university. There were police everywhere. The campus police department, which began this period as about a dozen gray-haired guys that would shake the doors at night, and one would always be posted at the library to make sure you didn't sneak out with a book. They were replaced for the most part. A few of them stayed on, but mostly they retired or dismissed. The chief of police of that department was retired and a new chief brought in, and a large number of new police officers were hired. The police department grew to between 40 and 50 sworn officers and about 20 or 30 additional personnel for just the campus over the summer. So when the campus opened up, it seemed like there were cops everywhere. Now I'm speaking from my own perspective and perspective shared by many students and faculty. In addition to those, because the war was still continuing and the federal government and lots of agencies had interest in Kent State because of its symbolism, there were all kinds of interesting people on campus that wore suits and drove plain four-door sedans and had short haircuts that everyone pretty much knew were outside folks. Because of the concern of all of this presence on the campus, a campus security advisory committee was organized by the president in 1972. As you all know, when an issue becomes a significant issue on a campus, what's one of the first things we frequently do? We form a committee to look at it. Well, that's what they did. And I was asked to serve on that committee because I had been, my wife says, dumb enough to volunteer to go along on a police ride-along program to see what the campus police department did, because a colleague and I were reading the student newspaper and it pointed out they'd had this program and that a single faculty member had signed up and no students except the law enforcement majors had gone on this program. So he and I said, well, that's not right, let's do it. So we went out one night. I went on what I later learned was kind of a BS ride. Nevertheless, I got on some list, and so I was asked to serve on this committee. The committee consisted of faculty and students. The war was still going on, and the students, unfortunately, that were picked for the committee were pretty radical, and the only thing they really wanted to talk about was a conspiracy. Now, in this day and age, and all the talk about conspiracies and so on, there were conspiracies back then, at least theories, and this conspiracy was between J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI at the time, President Nixon, and the local chief of police. I remember thinking if the bureaucracy could only work that well. In any event, after several meetings with the students wanting to only discuss that and not be very constructive, the committee disbanded. In 1972, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War group on the campus became suspicious of one of their members. They became suspicious of him because he kept talking to them about some weapons he had, specifically an AK-47 and a rocket-propelled grenade launcher that he suggested that he could make available to them if they wanted to do something dramatic. Well, they did some research and found out that he was an undercover policeman. And they set him up that next week to bring these weapons to their meeting. And sure enough, he did have these weapons, and he came down from his apartment, whereupon he was arrested by the Kent City Police for having illegal weapons. Well, when they discovered he was an undercover policeman, they called in the federal agency, the ATF, who said, we're going to let you voluntarily surrender these weapons. We're not going to charge you with anything, and they released him. But of course, the news hit the campus like a nuclear weapon. President of the university put this particular undercover officer on paid leave and said, get out of Dodge, which he did. But this raised incredible tensions on the campus again, to know that the campus undercover policemen had been doing this. I got a call a day or two later from the president of the university, who said, you no doubt heard about the undercover policeman. Yes, sir. He said, well, we have to reform this security advisory committee you were on. My immediate response was, no, thank you. He said, well, this is really important, and it's going to be an all-new committee except for you. We need some continuity. And you would be doing your university a great favor if you did this. I should point out I was not tenured yet at the time. So I agreed, okay, but I will resign immediately if it looks like it's going the way it did before. He said, I just have one last favor. I need you to chair this committee. So that's how I became chair of the then reconstituted Campus Security Advisory Committee. Well, of course, our task was to meet with the campus chief of police. And the first question was, do you have more of these undercover people on the campus? We don't want to know who they are and everything. We just want to know if you have more of them. And he said, I'm going to be completely and totally honest with you. You're not cops, and you can't know that stuff, so I'm not going to tell you. He said, I could lie to you and said there was 1 or 10, but until somebody uncovers one, you'll not know. But I'm being honest. I'm not going to tell you. Well, we addressed several other issues with him and got similar responses, and so the committee recommended that he be dismissed. My job was to call the president of the university and say, this guy is just not right for the campus. He said, okay, well, I'm going to stop any undercovers that are on the campus right now, and that was publicly declared, and so on. And the chief of police contract was not renewed. My committee was turned into a search committee to find a new chief of police for Kent State, which over the summer we did. And oh, by the way, you as chair of that committee, have oversight of the police department until you get the new chief in. So believe me, I was motivated. We did get a new chief who was a chief at a campus on the West Coast who got them through a substantial number of years following without any violence. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we were successful at that. But because I hired him, I became a consultant to him, and my committee, in fact, became advisory to the police department and functioned the way it was designed to do for the last 2.5 years I was there. From dismissing the chief to chief advisor, that's how that happened. You probably can't read this, but this is an article from the Toledo, Ohio in 1972 talking about our recruiting of the new chief of police and how my committee was involved in it. It even mentions me by name. So if you Google me, probably someplace you'll find even a reference to this. So how did a mild-mannered academic from Los Angeles become a Midwest cop? Sometimes you can get in trouble even at a Cub Scout meeting or when going shopping with your wife even. We were at a Cub Scout committee meeting and they were arguing, they had their annual argument about the Pinewood Derby races. Those of you that have kids and know, they build little cars and they race them down a track because every year they judge first, second, and third, and they have arguments who crossed the line first, and then they pick the prettiest one. So I said, why don't we call the local police department, Overland Park, and I bet they'd send a policeman to do that, and no one's going to argue with them. So they did. And they sent 2 officers, and everything went swimmingly. And I also built a little device for their track that would, with micro switches, determine which car crossed the line. It was great. After the event, I went out and shook the guys' hands and thanked them, and I noticed one of them was wearing something on his uniform that said reserve officer. And he said to me, when I thanked him, he said, I understand you're on the faculty of the School of Medicine. I'm a pre-med student and I'm applying this year. His name was Lester Landau. He went on to become a cardiothoracic surgeon and is still practicing in Kansas, at least as far as I know. I said, hey, I noticed that thing on your uniform. I didn't know that Overland Park had a part-time or reserve force. He said, oh yes, and we're always looking for people. Are you interested? I said no, because when we moved here, I promised my wife I'd spend more time at home and with the kids. And we'd been here 2.5 years, and I gave him that answer, and about 3 months later, I encountered the same officer while I was out shopping with my wife. And we were in a store, and she turned to me after a few minutes and said, did you notice that cop by the cash register? I said, not particularly. She said, well, either he knows you or he thinks you're stealing something because he hasn't taken his eyes off of you. Well, it turned out it was this young man that had been at the Cub Scout meeting. So when she went to pay for whatever, I went over and talked to him and wished him luck in his application. And he asked me the same question. I said, the answer's still the same. Well, when we got in the car, Pat said, you were talking to that cop for some time. What were you talking about? And I told her it was the young man that we'd seen at the Cub Scout meeting. And he asked me that question again. And she said, well, you've been a man of your word for the last 2.5 years. You've been around the house a lot. Maybe you should look into something. For 38 years, I think she regretted that. But that's how I went and applied and became a cop. Went to a 6-month academy, and I guess I did okay at it. So I retired with the rank of captain and had both a lot of fun and a lot of interesting experiences. And so that kind of helps me with this. These are a couple of things just I got from Kent State. This was just a certificate from the police department. And when I left, I was made an honorary commander for the police department. So. And with that, I appreciate your attention. I hope you may have learned something from this and be happy to answer any questions.